Welcome. This is the Echo Modernist Podcast. Our philosophy is based on sound science and free from the outdated dogmas of the 20th century.
Hi, this is Gabe Ignetti.
And this is Robert Steinhaus.
And this is the Echo Modernist Podcast. With all the predictions of gloom and doom for generations to come, it would seem that mankind would need nothing short of a miracle to escape catastrophe. So we've decided to offer a positive note and speak with two modern-day wizards about a breakthrough so big that it might make our present era look like the Dark Ages. We're talking about nuclear fusion.
Well, here to speak with us today are Drs. Ralph Moir and Matt Moynahan. Dr. Moir is a retired plasma physicist and a nuclear engineer from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and an expert in hybrid fission fusion. Dr. Moir has written over 170 publications, including participating with Dr. Edward Teller in his final paper. Dr. Matt Moynahan is a fusion expert who has appeared on the Space Show, as well as having written several fusion articles for Forbes and their industry tap. He is also the host of the Fusion podcast, which comes highly recommended. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Dr. Moir, I understand that you're a colleague of Dr. Edward Teller. Could you tell us a little about who he was and your experience working with him?
I was a graduate student and took Edward Teller's course and got to know him and worked with him over the years. And we'd go over to his residence in Palo Alto and talk about all manner of scientific questions. He was interested in all manner of scientific questions, political questions of our time. He was interested in fusion development, but particularly fission development for saving the planet. He was worried about global warming. We have to get off of carbon, and he understood that because of warming the atmosphere. But the carbon dioxide in the air will cause CO2 to be absorbed in the oceans and acidification. And that's bad news for sea life. And we depend very strongly for our protein on sea life. So he was very big believer, and we had to get back to deployment of fission in quite a large way to beat back the use of carbon, which we're becoming overly addicted to. He was quite an interesting guy to deal with. I enjoyed it greatly.
Could you give us a synopsis of where fusion power research is at and where it is going?
Controlled fusion has been worked on now for over half a century. And we're on this worldwide effort to make a power plant that has more energy than it takes to drive fusion machines. That's a big accomplishment, but far short of where we need to be to make a power plant that has net electricity and affordable electrical power. Human beings don't understand fusion well enough to be able to design plants based on it. Our knowledge is too primitive, unfortunately. But fission, on the other hand, very soon after it was discovered, it was powering submarines on the oceans within 10 years. And within another decade, it was making electricity cheaper than you could make it with coal, which is the case even to this day.
From my perspective, there have been about 220 fusion tokamaks that have been built, planned, or decommissioned worldwide. There is another body of effort around inertial confinement fusion. There are direct drive, indirect drive, fast ignition, and there is even a contingent of people that want to see ion beams used. So there's a family of approaches, and there's a similar family of approaches around magnetic confinement, tokamaks, stellarators, spherical tokamaks, a whole variety of concepts. There are a lot of ideas out there, and just like flight, there may be multiple solutions to the fusion problem. I mean, today you can get on a helicopter, you can take a plane, you can get on a hot air balloon, you have a kite, you can get on a glider. So 5 approaches to flight. Now, 150 years ago, flight was considered impossible. If you asked any person in America, in any city, is human-powered flight possible? They would have said, it's never going to happen in my lifetime. It will never happen. It is an impossibly solvable problem. Yet today we have 5 or 6 different approaches. The same thing may be true of fusion today. The general public has assumed that fusion will never actually happen at any time soon or within their lifetime. But there may, in fact, be multiple ways to make a fusion power plant that we just haven't explored.
We have examined one of the basic problems of fusion, and that is that the energy it takes to produce fusion power is more than the energy it produces. How great of a problem is that? Is that something that we can solve in the near term?
So the world record for efficiency in a tokamak was set in 1997 in Europe by the Joint European Torus. They put in 100 megawatts of power from the grid into their machine, and they pulled off 16 megawatts of power from the fusion reactor. But they didn't capture any of it because this machine that they built was a science experiment. It wasn't designed to actually capture power. So the world record is probably somewhere around 3 to 4% of net power if you consider 25% efficiency capture. Another record for tokamaks was 5 hours set in Japan by the TFT3. And a hot run, a record is 102 seconds set by China's East tokamak at 102 million degrees Kelvin. The longest actual fusion reaction that I know of in a machine that mankind has built is 132 hours. And that was set by a company in Wisconsin.
Okay, well, I think that there are even small fusers that amateurs have operated and produced fusion, not at huge levels, but, at levels of maybe 1 million neutrons per second or something like that. Not entirely insignificant. And there it's just a matter of how long you want to plug the thing in and create fusion events.
Right, but I've never seen a documented case of a fuser running longer than 132 hours.
Isn't it possible that if 100 million degrees of heat were to break out for even an instant, it would incinerate the reactor and burn up vast areas of the Earth's surface? Well, that's the fear. What do you think, guys?
I want to say that it's hard to predict what or if any kind of accident would occur in a fusion reactor, since we don't know what a fusion reactor really looks like. Like we said earlier, there are simple devices you can build in your home, and about 90 amateurs in North America have done that. So that's one example of a machine that does fusion, for instance. There is a startup company in Vancouver called General Fusion, and they surround their fusion plasma with a liquid lead fluid that they spin around at high velocities to protect their equipment. So that's another example of containment. On the flip side, for another example, is a whole branch of research centered around using laser beams to implode a very small amount of deuterium to make a very small implosion, so small that it wouldn't be as dangerous. So again, there's 3 examples of machines that mankind have built that do fusion, and each are totally different, and they have totally different safety concerns, regulation concerns, plant design, plant construction. So at this point, predicting what an accident with fusion is kind of like predicting what a plane crash looks like in 1750.
Well, I can appreciate that. We can get a decent idea to the magnitude of the scale of the problem. In fact, there are software codes out there for evaluating safety. Frankly, the primary safety areas that have come to the fore are more in the order of industrial style accidents than actual accidents involving fusion per se inside the fusion chamber. The kinds of magnets that we're planning to use in building machines like ITER are superconducting magnets that have to be held at cryogenic temperatures. If for any reason those magnets happen to lose the cryogenic cooling, it is possible for the energy stored in those magnets to then very quickly be turned into heat. And that quenching effect can produce even an explosion or a situation like that where you have a very rapid, unplanned increase in heat. That and high voltage worries are probably more safety concerns. And it actually cools rather rapidly if it actually comes in contact with any material, including air and the outer periphery of the reactor and things like that. So it really doesn't get very far and stay at 100 million degrees of temperature. But once it comes in contact with anything that's material, the temperature drops dramatically and rather quickly. So there's very little likelihood of any heated plasma escaping the actual confinement building or being a threat to the public at all. It's just not a practical concern.
It's really nice to warm up your hands near a fireplace, or even if you come close to a candle, you can come up with your fingers and squeeze it out. You won't burn your fingers because you'll make the flame go away. Even though the flame is a couple thousand degrees, it's going to be put out quickly. And I think that's the way to look at a fusion machine. If our walls of the fusion machine are a little bit away and well cooled, it won't melt. But if our fusing reaction pushes up against the walls, it's going to melt the wall, and the wall material, being iron, let's say, will rush into the fusion reaction and put it out. It's not like the whole reactor would melt down because the reaction would go away. The idea of a fusion machine is we're going to hold it with our magnetic fingers, so to speak. The magnetic fields are the bottle that hold this reaction, and we keep it off of the walls. And if we don't use magnets, we might have liquid walls or something. We don't want walls to be wearing out from stress and erosion. We want to insulate that with magnetic fields. Our experiments are working pretty well. Look on this as kind of like the Van Allen belts. The magnetic field around the Earth protects the Earth from the bombardment from the solar flux coming off the sun, and also from cosmic rays, and it diverts this away from the Earth and kind of rains down on us from the North Pole and the South Pole in the form of the aurora borealis, the northern lights, and that would come down straight to us if it wasn't for the magnetic protection we have around the Earth and the Earth's atmosphere. Now we got a magnetic bottle already.
Yeah.
There's been big news coming out of MIT concerning a breakthrough in fusion. Could you describe what it is and what that means for fusion development?
Yeah, it's pretty exciting. MIT, for the last 6 years, has wanted to build something called the arc reactor, which is basically a tokamak with superconducting magnets. But they couldn't get the funding from the federal government, and after years of trying, they found another way forward. They've raised $50 million from a private company, an Italian energy firm, and they're going to build something called Spark. And Spark is the newest, most advanced tokamak design that's out there, and it's using superconducting magnets. And I think there's a real advantage to using superconductors because in the past 5 years, they've come down in price, they've come up in quality, they've come up in fidelity. It's going to allow them to build a machine that will get to plasma temperatures that have not been gotten to before, and they're going to do it much quicker, much cheaper, and much more efficiently than any tokamak that's come before. And I think more exciting than that is the fact that this is going to be done in a company. A company can do things that a national lab or a university just could never do. And they can do things just better than some of the national labs because companies are good at things that government funding and government labs are not.
How come?
Because of the structure, because of the emphasis on profit, because they have to answer to investors, and because they can change directions much more quickly than a government or a university would allow them to do that. So I think this is really good for MIT because it's going to take a lot of work that's been sitting on a university bench and it's going to bring it into the private sector. And that's exciting. That's sort of groundbreaking.
From what I understand, the only byproduct of nuclear fusion is helium. Given our critical shortage of helium, is it a worthwhile goal to create a fusion reactor for the purpose of creating helium economically?
It's very, very much more expensive than where we get helium now, which generally we get them from oil wells and gas wells from down in the primordial center of the earth. It bubbles up from when the earth was made and from the radioactive decay that produces helium. And that is not too much in short supply, but we're maxed out now. We use all the helium we can get from there, from these gas wells. And I don't see artificially producing helium in fusion as ever being an economical alternative source.
The fact is that we would need 202,000 1-gigawatt fusion reactors to produce the amount of helium that we currently use each year. So it just would require an impractically large number of fusion reactors at this time to produce the amount of helium we use. As that basically is used up, we can sort of phase in some helium produced from fusion. Really, fusion helium can only be a supplementary, not a primary source of helium right now.
There are several byproducts from fusion reactions, more than just helium. There are commercial applications today that use fusion in their inner workings. When you do fusion, you get neutrons, and you can use the neutrons for applications. So since 2000, there have been companies that sell fusion machines on the marketplace that are used to generate neutrons. They're sold as neutron generators. The company NSD Gradle in Europe sold those for about 10 years. And now there's two companies, Phoenix Nuclear Labs and Shine Medical Technologies. Phoenix makes the world's best neutron generators, and they're available on the market on the order of millions of dollars. And Shine Medical is taking those neutron generators and using them to make medical isotopes for the medical industry. It's about $1 billion a year market. Shine broke ground in August on a new power plant. They're halfway through the NRC regulatory commission process, and they signed deals with GE Healthcare and China's largest medical isotope distribution company. So they have a manufacturing plant that has 8 fusion events occurring in their inner machines. They are attempting to go into neutron radiography, which is where you take neutrons and you can take pictures of, say, container ships using neutrons. So it's kind of like an X-ray. And there's one other application for fusion. It can be used in cancer treatment. You can use the neutron beam to kill cancer cells in a technique known as boron neutron capture therapy.
There's another form of helium in relation to fusion power I'd like you to speak about, and that's helium-3.
Yeah, helium-3 is one of the fuels that you can use to fuel a fusion reactor. You've got your deuterium. That's basically your cheap fuel that every amateur uses. So anytime you read about a teenager getting fusion in his garage or his basement, they're using deuterium. There's deuterium-tritium, and you can think about tritium as like a booster. You throw it into your fusion reactor, and you get maybe a 20-fold increase in your output. Tritium is expensive, it's hard to stockpile, it's hard to use. So if you hear about tritium, think government lab. And then there's boron 11, which is sort of the holy grail, the dream fuel. It's about maybe 50 times harder to fuse boron 11 than it is to fuse, say, deuterium. But if you can do it, you can create a power source with almost no radioactivity and no carbon footprint. And then helium-3, people get excited about that because it's easier to fuse helium-3 than it is to fuse other fuels, but helium-3 is hard to get. So there is a large supply on the moon, and so that's why a lot of people always associate fusion with mining the moon because there's helium-3 on the moon. There was even a movie called Moon, which the whole premise was Sam Rockwell was on the moon mining helium-3 for a fusion reactor.
I've heard it said that nuclear power has the potential to give us limitless free energy. What is your opinion about how likely this is to happen and how far off that might be if it does?
Well, it won't be free. We have turbo machinery. We make steam and we drive turbine blades and we drive generators, and all that kind of equipment will be the same if we substitute the energy source to be fusion. The fusion machine will have lots of equipment. The equipment will be expensive and it'll wear out and need replacing. And people will have to maintain it. We don't want to forget that electricity to be delivered to our homes comes over copper wires. The cost of all that and maintaining of that is about equal to the cost of generating electricity at the power plant. We see no breakthroughs there. That's expensive, but we're willing to pay for that. But it'll be economical.
Well, let's say how much of a factor lower than, let's say, what it is now.
Well, if it were the same cost as making energy from coal, we would choose it right away because coal is leading into global warming and ocean acidification. And that's going to have a cost to society. So we could actually be a little more than that, and it'll win right away. And the same with fission. If we have a fusion machine that's the same cost to make electricity in a fission machine, we'll take fusion right away over it because we're concerned about its radioactivity, and we're concerned about the activities can lead to proliferation of nuclear materials and nuclear weapons. So if we're pretty close, fusion wins already. And I think if we can beat it by 10% or 20%, that'll be wonderful. And then you pile on the environmental advantage of not making greenhouse gases. It's a big winner.
I agree with Ralph.
Energy probably will never be free. The utilities would still charge you something for it because they've got to make money somewhere. In terms of when fusion power may occur, I cannot say at this point when it would happen. I can say that there's a lot of unexplored territory out there, and there are people getting in the fusion game, angling to try, both on the venture capital side and in the startup space, and also people at the national labs and universities that are interested. It may come soon, it may come late, it may not happen in my lifetime. I don't have an answer for that.
I tend to be an optimist somewhat with respect to the near and midterm prospects of fusion. While I will not go as far out on the plank as Mr. Strauss did when he predicted energy too cheap to meter, I think that predictions and cynicism regarding the prospects of fusion are really not justified. The truth is that there is significant progress made each year in the field. And while that progress is not always effectively communicated to the public, it occurs nonetheless, and we get closer and closer to the goal. So I would just be a bit more upbeat and hopeful, and of the belief that certainly within my lifetime, I believe that we will see a cost-effective, reliable fusion power.
I don't want to come across as downbeat. I'm not. I actually am very optimistic about fusion. That's why I devote so much time and energy to promoting it. I just want to say, though, that I feel good about the prospects, but I'm not sure. And I can also say that there is a lot of unexplored stuff out there. We may already have several concepts that work, but we just never really pursued them from a scientific research perspective.
It seems to me there are more good ideas than there are funding sources to pursue them.
I would agree with that.
It's kind of an exciting time to be part of fusion efforts. Would be nicer if it all came together a little quicker.
Fusion produces more energy than fission. And I've heard estimates ranging from anywhere from 5 more to 40 more amounts of power, depending on what approach is used, depending on how the energy is captured, depending on how it ultimately all shakes out. At this point, it's not worth predicting anything more detailed than that, since we're so early in knowing what approach is going to win. I will say that 80% of the world's energy source is fossil fuels. So Fossil fuels have been burned for over 100 years, and they've been burned in times of wealth and depravity, during war, during peace, by communists, by socialists, by capitalists, by repressive regimes. Fossil fuels are very, very ingrained in the structure of our society and civilization. So dethroning them is going to be very, very difficult. Fusion is a very powerful tool in our toolkit that could be used to do that. But it's one of many tools that may be available, from solar to wind to geothermal to natural gas. So in fusion today, you're hoping that you get this tool to the human race fast enough, and then you're hoping that the human race will use it intelligently to stop carbon emissions and curb the effects of climate change.
Maybe one little shift in emphasis or additional view I would like to offer is we do have a lot of people all around the world that have no access at all to electricity. And it's a substantial number. It's about 2 billion people. And that's a severe impact right today, not the end of the century or a couple decades from now. But people have shortened lifetimes, have diminished opportunity, in many, many ways suffer as a result. And sad to say, we're not really making huge progress of bringing into the fold the full human population of the planet in terms of access to energy.
I want to say one other thing. Fusion alone is not enough, because it's got to be coupled with a whole other strategy of conservation and sustainable living if we want to persist on this planet.
Assuming that breakthroughs in fusion were to make it exponentially more powerful than fission, what sort of game changer could fusion be in terms of accelerating other technological developments going forward?
Well, fusion produces more energy than fission. Just at base, we're talking somewhere in the order of 10 to 20 times. You can't be more specific than that because we don't know which fusion approach will win, and we don't know what a fusion power plant looks like yet. But we do know it will make more power. The other thing is that it can make more power potentially on a smaller scale. So then you could talk seriously about doing things like going to Mars. And there's a whole branch of fusion research centered around using the technology for space flight and for applications on other planets like Mars or the Moon. So those are two huge things that would suddenly become very cheap and very available if we got fusion to work properly. I think closer to home, the idea of having cheap, clean, abundant, carbon-free energy allows you to do things like desalinate water on a massive scale, for example. It could sort of attack the 80% of the world's energy that comes from a carbon source and potentially curtail climate change, which is one of the reasons why I got interested into it so many years ago. And then there's another spin-off technology for generating medical isotopes. So there's a whole billion-dollar-a-year industry in the medical isotope field, and fusion has applications commercially in that realm as well.
You know, there's two other areas that I should mention that would benefit from cheaper energy. This is recycling. And the other, even more importantly so, is vertical farming, because there are major problems with conventional agriculture, from nitrogen runoff, CO2 pollution, soil erosion, pesticides, and the destruction of habitat. Vertical farming is something that really needs to happen in a big way.
Yeah, there's lots of applications for cheap electricity. If you can get cheap electricity, we really start to rethink human civilization. We think about it differently when we have these tools available to us. And the reason why I got into fusion was because it was the green thing. It was the zero carbon thing, but it also had the potential to be the abundant, cheap thing. So when the cheap thing and the green thing are the same thing, we can really go green and not break the bank doing it.
Well, you know, I'd like to backtrack a little. You said something very exciting, and that was about going to Mars and building new levels of technology that are capable of doing that in a better way.
Okay, fusion rockets. Now that's an interesting question. That looks like it's a practical thing for a plasma rocket. And we might have to drive that with electricity. I have a friend in Houston, Franklin Chang Diaz, who's working on electricity-driven plasma exhaust. And this would be good for making long trips like to Mars. And these thrusts are low thrust, long duration. So if you want to get to Mars in a year, be pushing half of a year, and then the last half of the year, you turn the rocket engine around and slow yourself down for half a year.
Yes, there are 3 variations on this. Variation 1 is you have a fusion reactor in a spaceship. You pull electrical energy off of that, and then you use the electrical energy to run your ion thrusters. Or variation 2 is that you put a fusion reaction at the apex of your space engine. So that you have, and the exhaust from the fusion reaction is shot out into space in one direction, and that pushes your rocket in the other direction. Variation 3 is that you have a linear fusion device sort of inside a cavity inside the reactor, and all the material that streams out from the fusion reaction gets caught in a magnetic nozzle that goes out the end and is used as an exhaust. There are currently 3 funded programs in the country to do this. The University of Maryland has a NASA grant to pursue this with a fuser variant. There's a research team in Germany that's doing something similar. There's a company in Washington State, Seattle, that's trying to develop a fusion space engine based off of field reverse configuration, which is another approach for fusion, a concept anyway. And then there's a small company in Princeton that's coupling with a professor at Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, and they have a linear fusion device based off the FRC. So there is interest in this. The funding is low. There have always been lots of ways that people have thought of to put fusion reactors onto spaceships.
Well, this is all very fascinating. I'd like our listeners to know, by the way, that Dr. Matt Moynahan is in the process of writing a book covering this area in depth if you're interested in finding out more about the field of fusion.
Yes, I've been blogging about fusion for many years, and I've always been frustrated with the fact that there wasn't ever one book that you could go to that would cover every approach that has been proposed over the last 6 decades. So there's a tokamak book or a inertial confinement fusion book, but there isn't a book where they do one chapter on tokamaks, one chapter on ICF, one chapter on pinches, one chapter on mirrors, and so on. And obviously, a book like that wouldn't be as detailed as sort of the deep dive books. But if you put all the concepts together and you discuss each one and you read them, side by side, you can make an apples to apples comparison of each approach. And I really thought that fusion was missing that. And so over the last 3 months, I've been working furiously away to try to write that kind of a book. And I've got the first draft put together, and now I'm going through and editing it and looking for an editor and a publisher. So I hope to have it out soon. People that are listening to this, if they want an advanced copy, they can reach out to me and I can get that over to them. So it's pretty exciting. I'm pretty excited about it, and I hope to have it out later this year.
Right. I know Matt's also been pretty active in the Quora environment, which is a platform for exploring questions about fusion and technology. And I think he has 50 or more Quora answers directly relating to fusion. So you could also find a lot of his good ideas out there.
Yeah, and I'm definitely afraid of saying something wrong. I try very hard to be accurate and clear, but I'm not perfect. So if anybody has technical issues with the content that I've written, please reach out to me. I love feedback. I love peer review, if I can get it.
We're thankful. Hardly could we be better represented, I think, than by Lawrence Livermore's most versatile nuclear designer.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And now for our final thoughts. There was a time when optimism about our future on this planet was universal, but After 2 world wars and a persistent and potentially existential environmental crisis, the idea of progress so central to the modernistic view was all but left for dead.
There is no doubt that the challenges before us are monumental. Regardless of how bad our present predicament might be going forward, it should go without saying that giving up hope is never an option. Dr. Moynahan and Dr. Moir have given us is a reason to have hope. Perhaps it just might be possible that the promise of superabundant energy will open the door to that brighter future after all. Let us dare to dream. Dream.
That's it for our show today. If you have any comments, criticisms, or suggestions, feel free to email us at ecomodernistpodcast@gmail.com. This is Gabe Ignetti.
And this is Robert Steinhaus.
We will be leaving you till next time.